So we have 24 participants. I'm going to go get live stream set up. And I think we'll get started in just a few minutes to make sure that we, 31. Yeah, people are starting to log on. So
cool.
I'm going to mute myself. And panelists, I think everyone can hear and see you now. So just a forewarning.
Is my image okay?
Yep.
Okay.
Question to the
So we're at 51 participants and all the panelists are on. I think we're going to give people, Kelsey, Gail, what do you think? Another minute or two?
Yeah, I think about a minute is fine. Now, Kelsey, regarding the questions, are you going to read them? I'm on my iPad, so I can't easily go to the chat box.
Yeah, so I'll give some instruction. If people have questions, how this is going to work, Gail will give us the full agenda, but the panelists are going to have some prepared questions from Gail after they present. And if you have questions as you're watching, you can drop them into the Q&A panel. So you'll see on the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can just hit the Q&A and type your questions in there. And then we will I will just answer the question, or we will ask our panelists to answer it live.
Okay, and I was going to mention that in my script. You're speaking.
Gail, just a reminder, you are live in front of 52 people right now.
Okay, so do I need to reference that again in my script about reminding people to put questions? Okay. Okay, let me know when I should start.
I think we're good to start. What do you guys think? Anybody? All right, Gail, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. Welcome to the Missing Middle panel. My name is Gail Price, and I am president of the Palo Alto Forward Board and a former city planner and transportation planner. Palo Alto Forward is composed of residents of various ages and circumstances. We are creating a sustainable future that expands choices, opportunities, and a quality of life for everyone. Our primary focus areas are housing and transportation alternatives designed to reduce traffic and parking demand. We hope you will become a member of Palo Alto Forward and stay informed. Our website is paloaltoforward.com. Tonight is a panel which is part of the Affordable Housing Month. SV at Home and other regional partners have coordinated various events to bring housing advocates together to learn and share policies and practices. The workshop purpose and goal is to address the issue and concept of missing middle. To some people, missing middle refers to or implies middle-income people who make too much money for subsidized housing but struggle to afford market-rate housing. Tonight, we will be focusing on missing middle housing types, all the diverse housing choices in between a standalone single-family home and a large apartment building. We will also be looking at various ownership and rental models. Examples of housing types include, but are not limited to, duplexes, triplexes, bungalow courts, single-room occupancy units, courtyard apartments, and townhouses. These diverse housing types are affordable by design and offer opportunities for people of various income levels to live in our community. Both more flexible zoning and financing options are definitely needed to expand these housing choices. For context, the city of Palo Alto is not meeting its affordable housing goals. We have either depleted or have negligible affordable housing funds at our disposal. And our jobs housing ratio continues to be a major issue. Lisa Ratner will make a statement about the League of Women Voters of Palo Alto and its co-sponsorship of this event. Go ahead, Lisa.
Yes, well, the League of Women Voters' position on housing is pretty simple. Every person is entitled to decent, affordable housing. In fact, the League supported the creation of public housing back in the 1930s. Many local leagues have housing and transportation committees that follow pretty closely what's going on in their local cities, and they advocate for affordable housing in their cities. The League is sponsoring, co-sponsoring this event as part of its, under its housing position, affordable housing position.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to give you an overview of the agenda. First, I will introduce the panelists. Please hold your questions until the end of the 3 presentations. Each presentation will be about 10 minutes. I will ask a few questions as a moderator, and then we will move to the audience questions. If you have questions during the webinar, please feel free to put them into a Q&A section, and Kelsey will read them and provide them to me. We are recording the webinar to share later. So to begin, our first panelist is Lisa Ratner. Lisa Ratner is on the board of the League of Women Voters of Palo Alto as advocacy chair and a member of the League's Housing and Transportation Committee. She also serves on the board of Palo Alto Housing, a local affordable housing developer. She is an attorney and a musician. Lisa will provide an overview of shared equity approaches. The second panelist is Elaine Wang. Elaine Wang is co-founder of Palo Alto Forward and has served on both the Palo Alto Comprehensive Plan Committee and the Housing Element Advisory Committee. She is a licensed architect in California and works on multifamily and master planning projects for Van Meter Williams Pollack. When she's not immersed in housing design work or thinking about how to create a walkable, bikeable, livable community, she can be found rummaging around her edible garden, dreaming up interesting meals to cook. That sounds like a great skill for right now. Elaine will provide an overview of local zoning ordinances. The third panelist is Matt Hutchins. As a founder of Cast Architecture, Matt Hutchins has focused his design and policy work to advocate for better density, abundant housing options, vibrant urban spaces, accessible open space, and sustainable buildings. In 2017, he co-founded the grassroots group More Housing Options for Accessory Residences, my apologies, to support zoning reform for accessory dwellings in Seattle, which passed in 2019. He co-chairs AIA Seattle's Housing Task Force and serves on their public policy board and on the city's design review board. In 2019, Matt was named one of the city's most influential people by Seattle Magazine. Matt will provide a case study about Seattle's upzoned neighborhoods. So each of the presentations, as I mentioned, will be about 10 minutes. And we will start with Lisa, following will be Elaine, and closing up the third discussion will be Matt. So Lisa, why don't you begin?
Okay, begin by sharing my screen. Let's see, there it is. That one. Is that up? There we go. Okay. I'm going to talk about limited equity housing co-ops for middle income housing. It's only one of many forms of shared equity housing. I selected it because there are a lot of people, believe it or not, living in housing co-ops across the nation. Today, 1.2 million families live in roughly 450,000 limited equity housing co-ops across the nation. Co-ops can take many forms. They can be duplexes, triplexes, apartment houses, cottages, bungalows, or single family houses. How does it work? The cooperative corporation, let me see, here we go. Cooperative corporation owns the land and buildings. Members buy shares, entitling them to occupancy. Long-term affordability is preserved by restricting the resale price of the shares. This alternative to renting or traditional ownership is much less expensive than buying a house, less costly than renting. Co-ops build wealth and tend to become more affordable over time because equity is retained in the cooperative. Let's take a look at how the first co-op opened in New York in the 1920s. We'll then take a brief look at the history of the tens of thousands of co-ops built in the 1940s to the 1970s. And then we'll look at a limited equity co-op which opened in Davis, California in 1985. Let's see, how do I make this thing go? When I was visiting New York City in 2015, I became curious to see my 90-year-old mother's childhood home, which she referred to as the Amalgamated. I found the Amalgamated across from the tennis courts of a spacious city park in the Bronx. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. Elegant stone Tudor-style apartments with garden courtyards surrounded by lush gardens, lawns, and flowering bushes. Had I stumbled into an English garden estate? This was my mother's childhood home? What was this place? The Amalgamated Apartments is a limited equity housing co-op. It opened in 1927, specifically to provide housing for moderate income families. And it's still operating 100 years later and still serves moderate income families. It was built by the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, whose members were trying to find a solution to their housing problems. They, like other workers, were trying to escape crowded, disease-ridden tenements. A shortage of housing following World War I in New York City in the 1920s led to extreme real estate speculation and unaffordable, constantly rising rents. New York State declared a housing emergency and imposed a rent freeze. Developers continued to build, but only for upper income households. Given the cost of materials, land, labor, and especially financing. It wasn't profitable to build housing for moderate income workers. Does that sound something like today's situation? So New York Housing Act of 1926 tried to address the high cost of building for moderate income people. The law offered property tax abatements for 20 years to sponsors in exchange for below market rates and limiting return on investment to 6%. It permitted mortgages of up to 2/3 the project cost, and cities could use eminent domain for site assembly. It was the first program in the nation to provide government subsidies to limited equity, moderate income housing. The amalgamated cooperative apartments became the first project built under this new law. Abraham Kazan organized union members to build quality housing for themselves. Their housing cooperative would charge a monthly fee based on operating costs rather than profits. By sharing the costs among 300 cooperators, they could lower individual costs and together do what they could not do alone. Okay. The union secured a $1.2 million loan from the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. Members needed to contribute 1/3 of the cost, or $500 per household. But nobody had much money. So the Amalgamated Credit Union, the union's bank, offered members loans up to 50% of the share price. The tax abatements, the efficient operations, and collective self-management, rather than hiring a paid management company, lowered costs to member tenants by an average of 25% less than rents in comparable apartments. The COP was a success. Waiting lists grew, and in 1930, the union opened a 236-unit amalgamated dwellings and 3 other limited equity housing developments in 1946 through 1950. The Amalgamated Bank, other unions, and philanthropies created the United Housing Foundation, which built 60,000 units of limited equity housing co-ops under New York's Mitchell-Lama law starting in 1958. Between 1949 and 1973, our Congress appropriated money to finance the building of limited equity co-ops, along with rental housing. By 1997, there were 100,000 units of moderate income, limited equity housing co-ops in New York State alone. Roughly 40,000 affordable cooperative housing units exist in New York today. But who lives there? Who lives in the amalgamated apartments today? Residents with a mix of low to moderate incomes, just like in the beginning. Minimum and maximum income levels range from $19,000 to $160,000 a year. Share prices range from a minimum of $20,200 for a studio, $25,000 for a 1-bedroom, and $33,000 for a 3-bedroom, and $33,000 for a 2-bedroom, $40,000 for a 3-bedroom. What are the monthly carrying charges? They range from $552 a month for a studio to $1,822 for a 3-bedroom apartment. This is 2017, no, actually it's 2020 rates. Seniors are eligible for Section 8 subsidies. Families who become over income pay a surcharge of between 5 and 50% when incomes exceed state regulations, but they aren't required to move out. Waiting times for apartments range from 2 to 11 years, depending on apartment size. The Amalgamated is home to 1,500 families in 11 buildings over several adjacent city blocks. It provides not only housing, but a community, including an education department, a fitness club, ceramics club, carpentry club, credit union, playgroups, nursery school, and programs for seniors, many who have aged there in place. That is what it looked like. And that's a facelift it received in the 1990s. So let's shoot forward about more than half a century to Davis, California. The 60-unit Dos Pinos limited equity housing co-op in Davis, California was built in 1985. How did it get there? Davis's inclusionary housing ordinance allowed developers to build up to 120 units in limited equity housing cooperatives, a number over the city's housing unit ceiling. It also offered streamlined approval instead of this usual 3 to 5 year wait. A developer with a mixed use project stepped forward to build a 60-unit limited equity housing co-op. Dos Pinos is the most affordable moderate income housing in Davis. In 2017, the share price for a 3-bedroom apartment was $33,000. In contrast, a single-family house in Davis sold for $632,000, often for cash, out of range of the median income family. Monthly costs are 50% lower than the average market rate apartment. Vacancy rate is near zero. The co-op has a 3-year closed wait list of over 100 families. It receives no property tax relief or other public subsidies. Units must be owner occupied. How does it work? Members purchase shares in the co-op, entitling them to live in 1, 2, or 3-bedroom apartments, and they have a vote in the governance and management of the building. The resale of the shares is restricted. On move out, members are entitled to a refund of their equity, plus annual interest on their shares based on the length of their residency, plus the depreciated value of improvements they made in their units. Monthly household gross income needs to be at least 2.5 the monthly assessment. No income limits are placed on who may live there. In 2017, 12.5% of the households were very low income, 25% were low income, and 25% were moderate income. The co-op builds wealth. In 2017, monthly carrying charges for the 3-bedroom apartment in Dos Pinos was $1,165, compared to a market rate rental of a comparable apartment in Davis of $2,388. The members' share, their $33,000 investment, would earn an annual 3.25%. That's the prime rate. This interest, plus savings from not paying market rental of $14,000 a year, adds up to about 52% of the original $33,000 investment. Members leaving or joining Dos Pinos also save a combined $50,000 in real estate transaction fees compared to buying and selling a condo. And some are eligible for tax deductions for their portion of the mortgage interest and property taxes. Dos Pinos has become more affordable over time. In 1985, when it opened, a family needed to earn 111% of area median income to afford to live there. 30 years later, a family needed to earn only 59% of the area median income. A median income family of 4 at Dos Pinos now pays less than 30% of their income for housing. Dos Pinos has become more affordable over time because no one pockets the increased value of the building and the land, but the equity is retained in the community, making homes affordable for future generations. So the limited equity housing co-op provides stable housing, builds wealth, has low entry and operating costs, promotes economic mobility and long-term affordability. Cooperative living provides not only a vital economic backstop, but also valuable personal connections in a community. I think the public has an interest in making its cities available not to just the very rich and the very poor, but also to moderate and middle income households from which it draws many of its essential citizens. Limited equity housing cooperatives deserve to be looked at seriously by cities and states, teachers, unions, religious groups, affinity groups, and nonprofits as a blueprint for helping to solve our housing crisis. There's a picture of Dos Pinos. More. Let's see what it looks like. And that is the end.
Okay. Thank you very much. And Elaine, would you like to begin with your section of the panel discussion and presentation?
Yes, sorry, I just had to unmute myself. Well, thank you all for stopping by tonight. I do want to preface that I'm probably not going to dive into the nitty gritty and the details of the zoning ordinances and the zoning code here in Palo Alto. I think that's not super engaging, but I do want to sort of take you through a walk. I love all the examples that Lisa just shared, and I want to share a few things that we have here on the ground here in Palo Alto, and I'm calling this oldies but goodies. All the awesome apartments here in Palo Alto and how we get more of them, because there actually are more than we think. Let me see if I can hit next. Okay, so here's a quick map of the zoning here in Palo Alto. And as Gail mentioned, I served on the comprehensive plan and the housing element community, what is it, the CIC. So the basically the committee made up of community folks. And I just wanted to share, you know, what our map looks like. All of the yellow, we have quite a bit of yellow here in Palo Alto, which is all single family residential. We have a few multifamily residential areas and some mixed use. What I'm not showing you is actually quite a bit of the open space, like all of the area to the south. And you'll be interested to know that most of Palo Alto's land, 58.6% in fact, is actually open space. But if you take that out, and you segment only the sort of the area where residential uses are allowed, the single family, the multifamily, the commercial, and you can technically do some residential and mixed use, you'll see that quite a major proportion of the land where we allow residential development is single family. So if you were to just take those four areas and break it out, in reality, the area where only single family residential use is allowed is about 78%. So there are a lot of categories. This is probably the only place where I really get into the specific zoning categories, but you know, R1 is your single family zoning. It's the one house per parcel. I think we're pretty much familiar with this. This is sort of like, you know, the American dream. This is what we in the post World War II era kind of came to, you know, deify everybody with their house and the white picket fence, kind of as shown behind Kelsey. But you know, it's very strict. It's one structure per parcel. There is a low density category in the zoning code. It's section 1810, and it allows the R2 and the what's called RMD, or like multifamily. But even the RMD really technically only allows 2 units per parcel, up to a calculation of 17 units per acre. And so oftentimes density in cities gets measured in this sort of units per acre count. And what that means is, if you guys remember what an acre is, it's 43,560 square feet. And so if you take your parcel and you divide that by the 43,660 square feet, let's say it's a typical 6,000 square foot lot, as is the standard R1 lot in Palo Alto, that comes out to be something like something between a sixth and a seventh of an acre. And at a sixth or seventh an acre and only one house per parcel, that's basically 7 units per acre. Typically, most multifamily residential is a little bit more dense than that. We also have these categories. The next chapter is like, I think it's 1830, which provides these standards for residential multifamily, up 20 units an acre, 30 units an acre, 40 units an acre. And you can kind of see here on the right, there's these different areas. Some have R2, some have R30. Our zoning maps in Palo Alto are a real patchwork. It is very challenging to read, and it's very segmented and fragmented, as you can see. There's a small RM15. It used to be RM15, was just upgraded to RM20. There's an RM30 here. There's maybe even an RM40 kind of over posted right here. But we kind of have like a hodgepodge of different zoning categories all across the city. And this map is just sort of a typical. We do also have commercial mixed use areas. I'm not really going to talk about this category because I think that's a little bit of a different beast from the sort of missing middle that we were trying to focus on today. But I want to zoom in a little bit on this College Terrace neighborhood, and I'll explain why. But in Palo Alto, College Terrace is basically this little area that's on the southeast side of Stanford University. It basically is sandwiched between Stanford and the Stanford Research Park. And it's, for those of you who know it, it's actually a very nice and lovable, walkable area. It's very typical, I think, of or actually pre-World War II and post-World War II communities. Gridded streets, a lot of network connectivity, small parks here and there. And you have, this fine-grained parcel structure that is, that permeates throughout. But I want to focus on it because College Terrace is really kind of in danger of losing its housing stock. There was a lovely, I miss her a lot. She was a former Palo Alto resident who's since moved up to Berkeley, Vanessa Warheit, who told me about this situation. And these were a couple of cottage clusters in College Terrace on Hanover Street. And she found out that they were, there was a permit application to take these two cottages, which were on two 25 by 125 foot parcels. But really, they were legally on a single 50 by 125 parcel that was zoned R1, single family, and could only legally allow one residential unit for the lot. And there was an application in 2016 to tear down both of these cottages and build one single family residence on the totality of the property. And that means that you are going to take out two houses to create only one. We're in a housing crisis, and the only legal thing that you can do on this property is to reduce the housing count. Why? Why is that the case? And so if you look at the zoning map of College Terrace, this is where that property is, over in the bottom left-hand corner. And it's basically in a sea of R1 zoning. Pretty much most of College Terrace, and I didn't show the neighborhood south of Hanover Street, but it's pretty clear that we've got a blanket zoning applied to this neighborhood. Now, if you zoom in, if you actually take a little walk, and I don't know if many of you are from Palo Alto or not, but a walk through the neighborhoods is actually kind of lovely, but it is no way a single family neighborhood. This cottage duplex, which is on Stanford, is by no means a single family. It was built in 1939, as I mentioned, zoned R1. There's two units. It's only actually a very small lot. It's 3,150 square feet, or 0.07 acres. And so if you were to calculate the density of these units on this lot, it comes out to 28 acres per unit, 28 units per acre, my bad. But it's basically a substandard lot. And if you were to take this parcel and build something on it today, there's not really much you could do. You can only do one unit, and you would need more parking. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why this doesn't conform to existing zoning. A couple of these cottages up the way, really, really cute, super kind of storybooky, but these cottages are not single family. These were built in 1937. It's R1. It's on a lot of 3735, so it calcs out to something like 22 units an acre. There's a whole bunch of other reasons why it doesn't conform to existing R1 zoning. All of these cottage duplexes, and this is really just kind of all over College Terrace if you take a quick jaunt and stroll through the neighborhood, they're not single family. You go to this clustered triplex down the way, it's not single family. It's built a little later, but today it's zoned R1. But when it was built back in 1950, they were able to put in three lots. It's a little better because it does provide covered parking, so it might meet some of the parking standards that we have today. But it's not single family. These cute little triplexes, built in 1938. It's a bigger lot size, so the density is a little bit smaller. But it's still not single family. There's a cute set of 6 cottages on Harvard Avenue. I highly urge you to go take a look at them. They're adorable. There's like a fun little parking garage or parking circle in front of it, but none of these things are single family. Some of the lots have since been parceled up. There's 4 different parcels that govern these like 6 structures, but none of them would really conform to traditional R1 zoning today. This is actually a really interesting property. I'm betting that somebody in the area bought up the entire cluster, but this housing cluster is not single family. The original structures were built in 1939, but it's actually a conglomeration of 7 buildings on a half-block lot. So it's a slightly lower density based on acreage, but it's definitely not a single family residence, and it's zoned R1. There is another zoning designation in the College Terrace neighborhood, and that's an RMD, or RMD Neighborhood Preservation. So that's a multifamily designation. But in reality, if you read the fine, the fine print of the zoning ordinance, it really only allows 2 units per parcel. So this is a really cute 4-plex on the corner of Yale and College, and it was constructed in 1958. It's RMD NP, but it's definitely not a single family or even a 2-family parcel. It's got 4 units, 8625 square foot lot size, and it's about 20 units an acre. So it still exceeds what is allowed in that parcel. This set of apartments is not single family, and it's not even 2-family. It was constructed in 1955. It's got 4 units, 6938 square foot, and so that calcs out to about 25 units an acre. So it really, kind of exceeds all the current development standards for a number of reasons. I like this one. This is actually right next door. These are 2 studios. Looks kind of like a cute little house, but it's not single family, nor is it even, I mean, it is 2-family, but it's on a tiny little lot, super substandard, and the density calcs out to 28 units per acre. But it's housing stock like this that enabled my husband, who lived in this parcel, in this little studio about 18 years ago, to stay in the community as a young professional. This is where he lived when we first started dating, just as a fun little aside. So, which brings me to a couple of situations. Now, I actually stumbled upon this when I was doing research for this presentation, and I found a staff report where, and I apologize if the applicant is on this. I don't know who's involved with this parcel, but I did find a staff report where the owner and applicant wanted to take this parcel, which was constructed in 1931 and then demolished in 1990, zoned R1, just an empty lot right next to the College Terrace Library. And he wanted to propose a 2-unit property. It's a 6,250 square foot lot. It has been empty for over 30 years. But what can you legally do on a lot like this? You can only build a single family house because it's zoned R1. He actually made a very interesting case. I went through the staff report and kind of pulled these things out, and all around this house there are so many examples of structures and residences that are multiple family dwellings, and he put forth what the current zone is, the date of construction, the number of units, and just look at this. There's not a single structure here that was built after 1978 or 1980. All of these structures are, 50, 60, 70 years old. Well, maybe not 70, 50 or 60 years old. And I think the current, just to kind of like take you back to a little, the current zoning that we have, it was kind of largely put in the late 70s, and it has been ridiculously prohibitive. So the applicant put forward, what can you do on an R1 lot and what can you do on an RMD? And he wasn't proposing something crazy. He just wanted to do a house plus an apartment so that there could be a 2-family unit, which would not be allowed under R1. And what did this poor person have to go through? Application submittal, project notice, project planner, public hearing. I mean, this was just, actually, this was the second application. There was another set of applications that went through before it. Just the simple act of changing from an R1 zone to an RMD neighborhood preservation district took a huge amount of process, and that's just to go from 1 unit to 2 units. Yet this applicant had demonstrated that so many houses in the area, residences in the area, were not single family or even 2 family. There were 4, 6, 7, up to 14 units. And this is really what is largely prohibiting missing middle, or what's called missing middle. I don't actually think it's missing. It's here. We have it everywhere, and in almost every single pre-World War II neighborhood in this country, we have tons of middle housing all over, but we have largely prevented ourselves from building more of it in the last 40 to 50 years. And we really need to be able to change that. This poor person went through, and this is just a year's worth of process. There was actually a previous application that was a year before that. So he went through like 2 or 3 years basically just to get the approval to change his parcel from R1 to RMD to build not 1 unit, but 2 units. When in reality, it could probably support more. So I want to just end on another case study. This is another empty lot. There are actually a couple of empty lots throughout. People like to say, oh, Palo Alto, we're all built out. But there are opportunities everywhere. And here's another case study at the corner, on Wellesley at the corner of College, not far from all the examples that I just showed you. It is an 8,000 square foot empty lot. God knows how long it's been sitting empty. It's been sitting empty for as long as I've known it, in the last at least 10 years. But my goodness, why are people not chomping at the bit to do something with this? Here's the context. Yes, there's some single family across the street, but there's also apartments, kitty corner and down the way. This is the stuff that's around the corner from it. A lot of it is small apartment structures that have been around for 50 years. So here's the zoning. As we remember, there's a site, most of it's sitting in an R1 zone. It's right next to an RMD. So it's sitting between, legally it's allowed to do 1 unit, but it's sitting next to a zone that would allow it to do 2. But is 2 really the right number of units that would be allowed on this parcel? When you zoom in and you see what's existing, my goodness, look at all of those addresses all around the block from that. Everything along here, along Williams, is a multiple family, 3 to 5 or maybe even more units. Everything around Wellesley, everything on College. The zoning doesn't fit the existing context. And this is the heart of the problem, and partially why we have a huge housing crisis. So about 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago, this article came out on Vox. I don't know if some of you remember it, but the headline was 80,000 people live in Somerville, Massachusetts, close to Harvard, and only 22 of its buildings are legal under current zoning. This is not just a problem in Palo Alto. This is a problem all over the country. And this was, taking, direct connection to what we're talking about tonight, missing middle housing, which I argue is not missing. It's in full existence. We see it everywhere, but it's been missing because we have not been able to build it for 40, 50, 60 years. So what did Somerville do? They realized, oh my gosh, we have a problem when all of our existing housing stock is not currently legal. So they put together a new zoning ordinance that was effective on December 12th, 2019. Good for them. This is exactly what cities all over the country, especially in California, should be doing. So in the span of 3.5 years, they realized they had a problem and they put into effect a new zoning ordinance. And this is exactly what Palo Alto needs to do. If Palo Alto really wants missing housing, the middle housing, the duplexes, the conversions, the cottage clusters, the triplexes, the fourplexes, we really have to legalize it, and we gotta change our zoning. We were supposed to do it in 2019 as part of the housing work plan, but we punted on it. And now we're in a serious COVID crisis, a public health crisis, and who knows when we're gonna be able to get to it. But if this is what we really want, this is the path we're gonna have to take. So thank you. I'll hand it over to Matt.
Thank you, Elaine. Go ahead, Matt.
Okay, let's see if this works. Oops. Okay, I hope everyone is doing well. Greetings from Seattle. We're having same issues you guys are, and it's except for us, it's a little more brutal because we don't get as much sun, and these days spring is out and everyone wants to go out, and so I applaud you for spending your time listening to a housing seminar. I want to start off with a number, which is 430,461. That is the number of people that are projected to move to Santa Clara County in the next 20 years.
Wow.
So that is, well, Palo Alto, I think, is about 70,000. So I am wondering where in your neighborhood you're planning to put 6 new Palo Altos in the next 20 years. So for decades, we've recognized the values of smart growth and walkable neighborhoods and transit-oriented development, especially. Yet the reality is that most current land use policies still basically enforce a car-dependent pattern of zoning land with segregated uses at very, very low densities. So the question is, where do we find spaces for 430,000 people and do it in an environmentally responsible and equitable way? See if I can. There we go. Okay. So in Seattle, we've relied heavily on this, what's called an urban village strategy, where it's transit-oriented development. In the last 20 years, 77% of all new households have moved into housing units that have been developed in only 7% of the land area, these so-called urban villages. I mean, it's great that they're oriented around transit and light rail. However, all the areas around those urban villages have not changed much at all. This graphic here shows where it's purple and kind of tall spikes. That's the population density greater than 12,500 people per square mile. A little different metric, but and then you can see the yellow and orange areas, which are traditional single-family zones, and those places are actually losing population because the residents that live there are getting older. They're either moving out or they may be dying, and that there aren't the young families that can afford to replace them. Now, the reality is that where we are going in Seattle, and I think that this is happening just about everywhere, is this idea of basically 2 cities. That one that is denser, younger, more diverse, and majority renter, situated around mass transit, and then another city which is richer, wider, older, and where the housing is eminently less affordable. This idea that there are 2 cities coexisting, or I should say, well, maybe not coexisting is the right term, but that's not necessarily new. Martin Luther King Jr. Said that every city in our country has this kind of dualism, schizophrenia, split into so many parts, so that every city ends up being 2 cities rather than 1. And I think that if we look at in Seattle, our projected growth around in King County, about 630,000 people in the next 20 years, we have the same issue. And our only plan right now is to pour more and more people into those same 7% of land area. And it's just not a very sustainable, equitable pattern. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some strategies for missing middle housing, because it extends the territory in which we can find places for new opportunities for people to live. The lens that I've been looking at this through is what I call green zoning. Green zoning is just putting people close to jobs, transit, schools, parks, and the amenities that they want, so that they can live a low carbon life. That's a huge benefit just in terms of sustainability, but that also has incredible ramifications for equity in terms of housing diversity, where people can live, opening up those neighborhoods, the quality of various school districts, and the amenities that we've already built in those those investments in parks, et cetera, that some people are certainly excluded from. So this is not so much a one-size-fits-all prescription. Whatever the density is of your neighborhood, there is always space to find for new housing opportunities, even when zoning says that that neighborhood is full. Now, I think whenever you talk about new households or density, there's a lot of fear, a lot of pushback, a lot of worry about what does that mean. And Elaine had some great examples of how terrifying those little cottages are at non-conforming densities. In Seattle, we have a very similar scare story here. Here is the Pine Street cottages. This is, these little houses are built, this is 3 or 4 times the density of the surrounding neighborhood, totally non-conforming, but incredibly popular. These little cottages sell for $750,000, and they're all under 800 square feet. If there's something so powerful about the walkable neighborhoods that we used to build, that people are thirsty for. So I also want to say that I think it's important as we're having these conversations about density that if we're only illustrating our stories with pictures like these, it's a bit of a bait and switch because I know that if we're developing new projects, they are not going to look like this. And so so I want to acknowledge this, but sort of move on to like other typologies. So in 2019, Seattle passed 2 zoning reforms. One was reducing the barriers to ADUs. Here are 2 ADUs. They're back to back on either side of the alley. We designed both of those for 2 obviously very, very different clients. But these days we can have not one backyard cottage, but a backyard cottage and an accessory dwelling unit. So essentially taking your R1 zoning, which you guys have, and turning it into 3 or a principal unit and 2 accessories. And so the goal there is, essentially, tripling the density. And we are currently working on several projects where they're kind of like co-housing like projects where we have a single family homeowner who wants to provide housing for their nanny and also have a rental. And so they're building a cottage and doing an ADU. And that is a really, really compelling way to split up the land cost and keep friends and family close and build community. The other zoning ordinance that we changed was this creation of what's in Seattle is called residential small lot, which I think would be comparable to the R2 that you have. It takes essentially all the R1 lots around the most dense areas, the sort of neighborhood villages, and basically doubles the density. Now, because we are able to do accessory dwelling units without owner occupancy, you can essentially create condo associations and lots of different configurations within residential small lot. This project here that I'm showing is we're taking the footprint of an existing 1-story single family house and then subdividing it into 2 townhouses, adding a story, and then creating 2 ADUs in the basement, and then in the backyard, creating kind of an oversized backyard cottage, but it acts as a duplex. And so you go from 1 lot or 1 household on this lot to 6, and yet you haven't really changed the perceptual, like the scale from street level. The other thing that this zoning allows, which I think we'll see a lot more of, is just duplexes and triplexes, because the density allows for a little bit, for more households, and also how you can slice this up with accessory dwelling units. And so this rendering here is of a stacked flat, so 2 stories, and then the sort of box on the right side is an adjoining ADU, one for each one of those units. And so we're taking just a standard Seattle lot and creating 4 units, and this could be subdivided, or not subdivided, but owned independently as 4 condos in like a co-op or a condo association. It's too bad that we don't build flats anymore, in part because of people's, really wanting to have ground-related housing. But I think with the upcoming silver wave of boomers wanting to downsize but stay in their neighborhood, there's going to be a demand for more universally designed locations that are, smaller, much more affordable, and very, very urban. This is another possibility. This is on a double lot where we've taken 2 parcels together, and each one of these individual parcels is 6,000 square feet. On this, we would be able to build 3 principal units and 3 ADUs, and then it's basically mirrored. And then we were trying to put back together the public space and create kind of a courtyard cottage sort of scheme. And this is something that I think is super exciting because 1, it's going to be a lot more affordable. 2, the scale of this zoning is really similar to single family. And so it's and the other thing is that with this zoning, you can also preserve a house in front and build something in the back. And so it's a way also for existing homeowners to be able to kind of make something more out of their property through resale or redevelopment. So I think that this is something that we'll see a lot more of. We're just starting to study these projects. The zoning just passed less than a year ago. So this is one of our first ones. On the left, you're seeing, this is actually 3 lots put together where the large blue block in the lower left-hand corner is the original homeowner, and they have a garden in the middle of their plot. And then there's 2 plots to the east of them. And they were looking at, well, what can we do with that? And it can be anywhere from 12 to 14 different units between ADUs, backyard cottages, and that could be row houses, it could be a mix, it could be row houses, cottages, duplexes. I think the great thing about this zoning, and the thing that I would want anyone who's looking at zoning reform to think about is to not be afraid of flexibility. It's really, we worry too much about what form the final building is going to take when we think about zoning, but in reality, what we want to have, and if we're going to support housing production, is you want to make it as easy as possible to come up with great solutions. So I love this project, but of course, thanks to the recession, they're on hold. And then I wanted to just throw one more thing in here, which I think is an opportunity that I think for neighborhoods that are maybe a little bit more dense and developed, in the mid-century, there was all the space that we've allocated towards parking is actually an opportunity to redevelop. Both of these projects were on the original parking lots of the structure in the front yard. And so on the left, it's an old triplex, and they had a parking lot and a little bit of a yard. And now we've added 10 apartments behind this existing triplex. And then on the right, it is 4 units. You can't see the one that's kind of a daylit basement, but 4 units that stack up. And that also was on the back of an apartment building. And so, we have, for the areas that are zoned for multifamily, there's a ton of parking, there's a ton of open space. We just have to keep our eyes open for it. Um, let's see, this last little slide, this is just going back to an original study of all the different housing types. This is taking a Seattle single family neighborhood and just looking at what happens when you allow for stacked flats, apartments, duplexes, little cottages, all those things to happen. In this case, what I'm showing is doubling the number of households in this neighborhood, and yet the impact in the street over a course of a generation is not that crazy. I think one of the most important lessons about this is when talking about upzoning or zoning reform or anything like that, this isn't the end of the single family house. This is just the recognition that the single family zoning is unhealthy for the city. It's unhealthy for the planet. You know, we're just opening the door for other types of housing, stacked flats, duplexes, triplexes, things that we used to build, we used to know how to build before they were zoned out of existence. Land use policy dictates where people live and work, and in many ways, you know, the entire course of our lives. And these policies either are baking in car dependency, they're baking in, you know, class and race segregation, or they can be an opportunity to break those structures down. So I think there's so much potential in our existing neighborhoods, and it doesn't have to come at a sort of radical price. We just have to be open to that opportunity. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt. Okay, thank you again to all the panelists. So I'm going to ask 2 or 3 quick questions. This is kind of a lightning round, and I'd like each panelist to briefly respond to each one, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. The first one is, please note one state or local policy that would make housing more affordable here. And why don't we start with Lisa?
Lisa, you're muted.
Yeah.
All right, got it. I think cities should encourage the formation of housing co-ops and other shared housing. I think they should offer long-term leases on city land, or donation of city land. They should have a policy like San Francisco does, which is to purchase small lots and donate those small lots to co-ops or community land trusts. I think tenants should have the right of first refusal to buy their apartments if they go up for sale, to see if they can turn them into some kind of shared housing. And the city should give assistance in forming, technical assistance in forming these co-ops. I realize that there are definitely challenges with the COVID situation, but the types of financial assistance that we're talking about might be doable through philanthropies, or even some kind of, well, anyway, I'll leave it at that. I also think a no net loss ordinance would be very useful. So the sorts of things that Elaine was talking about, losing housing that is existing to redevelopment, where you end up with a smaller number of units, that would be prohibited under a no net loss ordinance.
Okay, thank you. Elaine, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think extension of our accessory dwelling unit policy. So I think there's been some questions about SB 330, and you know, can we get 3 units out of that? I think what Matt was mentioning about being able to do 2 ADUs per lot is a really great one. But I think just by extension, I think what the local level governments should be able to do is actually waive fees. I think the fees that are imposed at the local level, especially for things like parks. I mean, we all love parks, but I gotta tell you, the parks fees are really astronomical, and they make the increased cost of these backyard units sometimes fairly prohibitive. I mean, it's already expensive to build. Why do we need to keep tacking on, additional fees that, individual landowners may not have?
Okay, thank you. Matt?
Well, since I don't know your zoning code, I'm just going to take a shot at the dark and say that, yeah, reducing the barriers to ADUs wherever you can is a huge way to kind of empower, do-it-yourself, one-off development. People doing it for themselves, and at that scale, at that granular, level, it's super beneficial for the neighborhood. I don't know what sort of design review process you guys have. I serve on a design review board here in Seattle, and we've been having these discussions as to what a real mandate is in the face of housing unaffordability. Really, does it make sense to be stressing up or causing all this process over, what color the roof is when people don't have roofs over their heads? And so if you have a design review process, I think measuring that against the crisis that we have at hand is a really important way to bring more housing online.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question, what is your favorite example of a neighborhood with diverse housing types? What and where? So why don't we start this time with Elaine?
My neighborhood. I didn't show the slides from my neighborhood, but I think and a couple of you who may have been on this or at this session 2 years ago, I shared a number of them, and I live next to 7 units. There's lovely single family houses across the street, but there's also, duplexes and things and fourplexes up and down the street. And I mean, the problem is that most of these structures are, gosh, they're a heck of a lot older than I am. They're 50, 60, 70 years old. And I just wish that, we could replenish them, add more. And if every neighborhood could be like my neighborhood, and I guarantee you, if you could walk down my street, you would not think it was scary at all. But it is still rather dense.
Okay, thank you. Lisa, could you respond to that?
Yeah, nearby my neighborhood, I live in the Fair Meadow neighborhood, but Green Meadow is not far away. There's a lovely set of duplexes at the corner of Alma and Green Meadow. There are 17 on one side of the Green Meadow and 17 on the other side, and they fit right in with the single family houses. They're in the same architectural style. One of them is an affordable housing community and one of them is a market rate community, but they seem perfectly great, just nestled there in the Green Meadow single family R1 zone. It's great.
Okay, thank you. And Matt?
The thing that jumps out at me is our projects there that are really dense with modest housing, and then use that to create, big open space. So like the Pine Street cottages that I showed, but then also I remember when I was in grad school poring over maps of Phoenix, which is all just single family house forever and ever. And then every once in a while there was this pocket park that was entirely private because it was at the center of some development that had 15, 20 houses around the perimeter and then open space in the middle. And that sort of surprise and common amenity space has always been something that I'm all for high density, and then you marry that with great open space, and that's just a wonderful way to live. And so so I don't know if it's necessarily neighborhoods, but I certainly look for that sort of land use pattern.
Okay, thank you. And my last question, how do we get neighbors to welcome multifamily housing of various types in our respective neighborhoods? So let's start with Lisa.
I guess you have to take them around and show them that it already exists in Palo Alto. It exists in the downtown area, certainly. and it exists in Elaine's neighborhood. People in Green Meadow are, I'm sure, are aware of, or should be aware of, the duplexes that exist in their neighborhood. I think taking people, pointing that out and taking them on a tour.
And this is Angie. I'm not a panelist, but I just wanted to actually give like a props to Kelsey and Elaine, who put together a walking tour doing just this. And I, for one, would love to see it happen in Palo Alto again. And I know lots of other cities that would like to see it too, because you're absolutely right. The more we see that this is already there and that we love and appreciate these neighbors who are living there and have been living there, the more we'll accept those. That's
Okay.
it.
Okay, thank you. And Matt?
Let's see. So I was heavily involved in the fights over both those land use reforms, and they were just absolutely bitter, very, very divisive struggles. And I think the thing that was really the most powerful is telling the stories of the people that live there or who want to live there. You know, it's not enough to show the cute cottage, because people understand that that's not what's going to get built if that zoning, you know, break is let off, right? But understanding that it's their, you know, it's the teacher and it's the barista and the waitress and, you know, all the people that you know are, you know, today's essential workers, right? That are going to live there and love it and be part of that community. Those stories were probably the most powerful, more than any sort of, you know, diagram of what the zoning, you know, impact would be. And I think having approaching it from an environmental standpoint, an affordability standpoint, and an equity standpoint, those are all really important narratives. And then one thing that Seattle did as part of the recent mandatory housing affordability reform that created residential small lot as part of the accessory dwelling units, is that as part of that, we instituted a floor area ratio, which we had never had in single family zoning. I think one of the things that is the most disruptive to neighborhood fabrics is not multifamily, it's the McMansion. And so people were seeing these McMansions that were incredibly out of place and you know, out of scale, and, you know, but we're housing, you know, 2 people, right? And that's the sort of worst case scenario. And so by instituting an FAR, floor area ratio limit, and then including making accessory dwelling units free, exempt from that FAR, makes it so that anyone who's developing a new house is almost guaranteed to want to use that extra 1,000 square feet per ADU and include that as part of the building mass. And so what we're seeing is 2,500 square foot houses. You know, before this, we'd see 5,000 square foot houses on a 5,000 square foot lot. And now we can see a 2,500 square foot primary residence with 2 accessory dwelling units baked into that form or in the backyard. And so there's already the potential for 3 households to live there. And whether or not that happens, I mean, I hope that it does, and that, you know, developers aren't skirting the rules too much. But by doing that, we're combating the disruptive McMansion, that sort of tear down Lux housing that people really hate, because that's what's really displacing a lot of people in neighborhoods. And then we're combating that by creating the opportunity for 1 or 2 extra units for every teardown. And so that was something that was that really disarmed a lot of people who were prone to not want to support any sort of development, because they were like, hey, you know, houses in my neighborhood are not going to get torn down, and if they do, they're going to house 3 families, you know, that are going to be, and it's going to be less expensive, and my nanny or, you know, our son's teacher is going to be able to live there. You know, that's a really good mix of carrot and stick.
Okay, thank you. And Elaine?
I second what Matt just said. I second what Lisa said. The only other thing that I don't know if this appeals to most people, but Minneapolis had a Neighbors for More Neighbors campaign, which I thought was really great. You know, it's about being welcoming, and you know, I'm a neighbor, I want more neighbors. I don't know if that's compelling or not, but I do see that as a you know, a kind of a you know, a welcome, a doormat, you know, for new people.
Okay, thank you. So we appreciate your responses. Kelsey, so why don't you take the lead on the questions that have been submitted by the audience? And what is easier? Do you want to direct the questions to the panelists, or do you want me to choose?
I think so. If I have a question that I would like you to choose, there are some questions that it's fairly obvious who I should be directing it to. So I'll start with that, but if I want your help moderating, I'll let you know.
Okay, thank you.
The first question, I'm going to kind of combine multiple questions here. So people were really curious, Lisa, how do we actually get these limited equity cooperatives politically? So like, how do we have to lobby? How do we achieve this locally? How do we achieve this vision?
That's a good question. I think first people need to understand that they've worked for the last 100 years, so they're not a new idea. They have to be familiar with what was done. I think in New York State, there's some up in Washington State as well. Get familiar with that so they can talk to elected officials about an ordinance that would encourage the building of this kind of cooperative housing. There's actually some legislation already on the books, which in California, which gives some preferences to limited equity co-ops. So people in this California state legislature know about it. But the National Cooperative Bank is available as a resource, as is an organization called Grounded Solutions. And both of those organizations would be great places to start to get technical assistance in organizing a co-op.
Great. And then another follow-up question about co-ops, kind of thinking through how co-ops make decisions, I think. So how do you avoid co-ops from being mismanaged against members on the board who want to avoid costly renovations? And then how do you think through the costs and benefits of doing a rent increase, like being limited by that rent increase, because theoretically, if they were able to increase the rent, they could do more limited equity cooperatives, like build more housing, I think is the question. But let's stick with the first one, and then maybe I can figure out what the other question is getting at.
So most of the successful co-ops have had extensive board training, extensive cooperator training. It's something that when we're talking about technical assistance to setting up a co-op, you really need to have some education as to how boards work, how to manage a property, and what the responsibilities of co-op members are on the boards. Often they will delegate management to a private company, but that makes it less affordable. Any kind of cooperative situation, you're going to have challenges, people not getting along. It's just the nature of working in these kinds of organizations. I think condo boards, market rate co-ops certainly have a tradition of having challenges in organization. But again, I think it comes down to education. And that's something that organizations like the National Cooperative Bank can provide.
Okay, so my next question is going to be directed towards Matt. And this is the question, although maybe other panelists want to jump in here, but the question is, how do you respond to critics of density who say that Palo Alto is not Seattle?
I think that's easy. I mean, the whole idea, my sort of thought about green zoning is that there's room, anywhere there's an existing neighborhood, there's always room for more housing, whether it's happening in, parking lots and side yards and backyards and, by allowing the conversion of existing houses into triplexes and duplexes. So it's, again, not a one size fits all scenario. I mean, I think I showed a spectrum of housing that is, from we build things that are, as small as 300 square feet, backyard cottages. And so, so I think that, you can look around your neighborhood and find precedents for where additional density has happened in the past. That's an awesome way to start. And I think then you just, I think you can, whatever the sort of density you have or the neighborhood form that you have, there with a little creativity and also just some reverence for how people have built houses and in the past, you can find ways to blunt that criticism and overcome it.
Any Palo Altans want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to hop into that, I have a friend who actually suggested one time that why not implement an incremental density policy? So if you have, one house, you should be allowed to have two. If you currently have two, you should be allowed to have three. If you have three now, you should be allowed to have four. And if you did that, nothing would ever, you would never get the major jumps and shifts in scale. You would simply just get what cities have done and communities have done over time, is just a steady incremental accretion of layers of different housing types. And I think, when I was part of the housing element community panel, I talked a lot about gentle density, and you don't need to be scared of the word density. There's so many ways of doing it. And I mean, as I mentioned earlier, they already exist in our communities. And so if we can just incrementally add a little bit here and a little bit there, you can definitely add housing stock, especially smaller scale housing stock, which is what is really missing. There's a huge mismatch in the needs of what people, there's increasingly, single person households or two-person households, and you don't need a 3,000 square foot house. And there's a huge need for these smaller units, but we're not actually meeting that. And so if you can add a 600 square foot apartment here, or an 800 square foot cottage, or even a 1,200 square foot, small house behind another house, that can serve a lot of people.
I just want to piggyback one other thing is that for a lot of people, density is a dirty word. And so I definitely try and talk about housing opportunity or options or households, and not density and units and, things that make it seem much more impersonal. It's another way to I think that I find people I'm talking to cringe if I say that, say density as opposed to, but they're certainly, they can see who those people are that live there. Again, those are stories that you can find in your community. You don't need to be from, see it in Seattle, that you can find those stories in your community and tell them, and that'll help your pitch.
Okay, so the next group of questions that I'm grouping together is about parking. So Matt, a number of people were questioning how do you have these various dense housing types? How do you handle parking? yeah, I do think Seattle has more transit than what we have in Palo Alto, but if you could just comment on how you think about parking, and then other panelists feel free to jump in on the parking question.
Yeah, yeah, I don't think that maybe one of those projects had any on-site parking. For the most part, one of the major reforms with the ADU changes was to eliminate the parking requirement for the backyard cottages, and it's still required for the house, but that's important. And inside urban villages, we don't require parking, although the market dictates that a lot of parking does occur. I think that our transit system is not super great, but it's basically bus oriented, which is kind of sometimes a mixed experience. But the real thing for us is to look at what the walk sheds are. If you think about where the super high the things that we think of as transit, like rail, or high frequency rapid ride bus, yeah, it's pretty limited. But once you start thinking about neighborhood routes and extending out a half or a quarter mile or a half mile, like what that real walk shed is, it's almost the entirety of Seattle. It's just a few places where it's sort of out of the way because of it's a peninsula jutting out into the water, that sort of thing. And so I really recommend that you broaden your thinking, because we can't just orient density towards transit, but need to start thinking about forcing, or not necessarily forcing, but utilizing the idea of the walk shed. I mean, so that's anything within a quarter mile should not be R1. Anything a quarter mile of a high density or a high frequency bus stop should be R2 or whatever the next level up is. And that's really the only way, it's chicken and egg. That's the only way to build a transit system too.
Anyone else want to comment on parking in Palo Alto specifically? I will just add that I live in a neighborhood now where there is tons of parking on the street, but parking is not an issue here. But there are some neighborhoods, the few neighborhoods where we have allowed multifamily housing do tend to have parking problems. But yeah, Elaine or Lisa, do you have any comments on?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I just want to share is that I think there are different, just as there are different household sizes, there are different households have different transportation needs. And oftentimes I'll be in a conversation with a local transit advocate who often wants to do salons to talk about, because I think there's still this idea out there that if you are in a 2-income household, or you have a family, you immediately have 2 cars. And I'm starting to see more and more, and our family is in this. We're a single car family, and we have been for like at least a decade. And but there are people in the community who don't know anybody who fits that mold. And I'm not going to say that everybody in my neighborhood is like that, but I do see increasingly that there are more folks who are not using as many cars, or are investing in cargo bikes or whatever as their second mobile. And so I think this is evolving. I know a friend of my husband's mentioned that he wanted to get rid of his second car and get another bike because he just it was sitting around and he was paying insurance, and it was just eating up space and money.
Yeah, it's super tough because the Bay Area or South Bay, right? It's almost impossible to not conceive of a life without a car. But by the same token, we're going to come up on that reality pretty soon, just because of climate change and all that. And the other thing is that there is a surprisingly high number of people who can no longer drive. We talk about our aging population, and the idea that we have to, I mean, I don't know how many times I heard it in in public meetings is like, well, I'm older, I have to be able to drive to the grocery store. And really the inversion should be like, I need to have a grocery store within walking distance because I'm not going to be able to drive. I think it's like, a third of people over 65 don't drive on a regular basis or don't have a car. And the idea that we're still using that to fight development that would create walkable neighborhoods is really, crazy to me.
Mm-hmm. So one question about kind of environmental justice. So how do you think air quality features into our debate? Because a lot of our home building, especially high density home building, has been along high traffic roads, while low density zoning is really in the surrounding areas that tend to have better air quality. So Gail, I don't know if you want to suggest specific panelists for this one, but could be for anyone.
Go ahead, Elaine.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things in this sort of shelter-in-place world is, I think there's a few Stanford scientists who have found that air quality has actually improved significantly in a lot of countries and a lot of communities. And this is true of California and true of the Bay Area and true of Palo Alto. Most of our air quality issues actually come from auto dependency, especially single occupancy vehicle auto dependency. And that Palo Alto was one of the first cities to push on some real, to put together a sustainability and climate action plan. And we've got a great climate action plan, but a lot of it is really going to have to hinge on reduction. In order to reduce our greenhouse gases, we really need to reduce single occupancy vehicle use and be less reliant on our cars and create the communities so that our homes and our parks and our libraries and our stores and our everything that we need as essential is within walking distance, within that walk shed or within a bike shed of where our homes are. And we shouldn't be afraid of a little bit of additional density in order to support those businesses or to support those services or to support the comforts of life and to get us that high quality of living. European cities, you go to all the cute little hill towns in Italy. I mean, they were all built on this model, of very, very dense areas, walkable areas, reachable by foot, and not dependent at all on the automobile. And that is really what will get us to, the climate and air quality issues are very much linked, and the housing patterns and the land use patterns can very much assist with that. So, the more that we can facilitate housing creation in a walkable area where we don't need to depend on the automobile, and we can achieve that reduction in air quality or increase our air quality and achieve reductions in greenhouse gases and emissions is really, this is where all of these things come together. All the same solutions are converging to solve multiple problems.
I actually have 2 slides that I didn't show that are exactly this. Here, if you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen again. Oops, let's see. I talk about double density and what's the benefit of that. Oh, come on. Oh, let's see. Here you go. What is the impact of doubling density? If you take the total carbon footprint or the total US sort of, carbon dioxide emissions, and you model the savings if you have people driving a lot less or having twice as much or doubling the density, it reduces the household carbon load by 48% and residential, the residential energy consumption, because they're new buildings, by 1/3. Altogether, just taking that one step of doubling density is a savings of about 18% of our total carbon dioxide emissions. And then, let's see, I think I have one more slide. If it's gonna go. Oh, maybe I don't. Oh, maybe I pulled it out. Yeah, I think I did. I must have pulled it out, but I can also share with whoever's interested. But I did a map of one of our corridors that people drive every day, our kind of super commuter corridor from downtown to out, in a bedroom community, and mapped the vehicle miles traveled and the carbon load per capita and relative to density. And it's really clear if we want to reduce carbon emissions where we need people to live, and that's as close to where they work as possible. That's it.
Great. So I have another question that was directed towards Matt, but anyone can jump in. But what are some challenges of preserving the urban canopy during redevelopment? I think this is really pertinent to Palo Alto because we have very good trees here. Old growth trees can provide shade for cooling effects, and how can that be preserved while providing new housing?
If anyone else wants to jump in, I feel like I've been talking too much.
Go ahead, Matt.
Okay, street trees. I don't know what kind of a program Palo Alto has, but I think that every municipality should be enforcing street trees in the right of way. I just don't think that, if you drive down or walk or ride down a street that has a tree canopy over the sidewalk, the benefits to those residents and also just to air quality and quality of life is just so much more important than a tree in the backyard. And so I've been trying to get Seattle to require street trees for every single family project. It's currently not allowed. So I think that's a huge element. The other thing is mandatory replanting. And so with every new project, there's a pretty strong agenda for replacing trees that are lost. And so I think that that's something that, I guess the thing is I think it's a false choice to support density or trees because I would much rather have, as I said before, rather have lots of units that are compact and modest, and that leaves a bigger open space that can really have, space for recreation and trees and landscaping and gardening and all that kind of thing, as opposed to, in small side yards and small front yards and that sort of thing. So, so that's kind of probably a big zoning shift is to look where your envelope or your building envelope and your zoning code shouldn't be if it's going to support tree growth.
Anybody else want to jump in on the tree question? Otherwise, I have another question that I'm kind of going to paraphrase. So the question is getting at, so we may allow ADUs and anyone could build an ADU, but how do we know how many people could build an ADU? And the twist I want to put on this question and the concern I have heard from council members about missing middle housing is if we allow it citywide, then everyone will do it. And then we'll be just overcrowded. It'll overrun the neighborhood. So please respond to that concern.
It's in our numbers. Palo Alto, what did we do? We modified our ADU ordinance back in 16, 17. And before that we were permitting 4 ADUs a year. 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Really scary number. And when we finally relaxed that, those standards, I think we got to 30 the next year. There was a lot of interest. I think that there was a lot of interest. I think, the city held discussions and, 100 people would show up just to find out more. But it's not like we had a huge, onslaught of ADUs. I think they've since evaluated it and made some additional modifications. So maybe we're getting like 50 or 60 per year. But if you think about the housing deficit that we've incurred over the last 30 years, which is thousands and thousands of units, 60 units is really 60 units a year, even if we was for a decade, that's 600 units. Oh my God, that's not even a drop in the bucket. I think what we need to do is be evidence driven and look at the numbers and see where we are. And the evidence suggests that we are not by any means close to an ADU onslaught, and just the floodgates have not opened. Let's just be realistic. I think there's a lot more that we can do to increase that number, and we definitely want to do it safely. We don't want to be encouraging illegal structures and having people just kind of like jerry rig or MacGyver, little things together, because that is not going to do anybody a service. So if the city needs to do things to make it easier, if we need streamlining, I've already talked about fee reduction. There are a lot of things that we need, to pre-vet, certain designs so that they can just go in. Let's do all of that and see how those numbers turn out. But it has really not been the experience in the last 3 or 4 years that we've had a watershed of ADUs. And I don't really know, I think that we've run ADU events over the last 3 or 4 years, and the interest has been great. So I do think that there is interest. I think the reality right now, I don't know what the totality of the interest is, but I think the reality of it is that it is still somewhat prohibitive. And we may not see more because of the public health crisis that we're encountering today. It's probably going to slow.
I absolutely agree that ADUs are fundamentally quite expensive to build. And so there's inherently a headwind against any of them getting built. And so, in Seattle, we're getting 60 a year, out of 135,000 home, of single family parcels, right? And now with the new zoning code, I don't know exactly what the number is, but if we double that, great, but that's still a tiny, tiny drop in the bucket. And so the idea that that they're going to just fall from the sky is sort of a Chicken Little, kind of a story that really, you don't see them from the street. They have no visual impact on the street. There's really just maybe some impact on the 2 immediate neighbors or the 4 immediate neighbors. But the probability that that's one of your neighbors that's going to be building one is so small that the probability that you're affected is low, and the impact is also super low. And so, I think that, yeah, it's unfortunate that we're not getting massive numbers of ADUs, but it's because they're expensive to build. Where like in LA, where they saw, once ADUs were legalized statewide, they went from a couple a year to 2,000 or 3,000. And those are all illegal units that are getting converted to legal residences. And that's actually a huge benefit to take all that housing out of the shadows and into the up to building code, right? So that those are healthy, habitable places to live. And so there's a lot of, I'm sure that Palo Alto has tons and tons of illegal ADUs that if you were to allow more of them, to grandfather those in, that they would, suddenly you'd see all these things, pop up, and neighbors be like, oh, I never knew that you had one in your backyard. And I'm like, yeah, I just couldn't show you because I didn't want to get in trouble.
Kelsey, I think we need to start winding down. Did you want to move to the next section on the agenda?
Sure. Although I just have one quick question just to clear it. It's a yes or no question. Matt, are you using Arc Urban to show the 3D buildings? I don't know.
Let's see. That was I use a combination of ArchiCAD and SketchUp.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I didn't properly introduce myself at the beginning. My name is Kelsey Baines. I'm on the board of Palo Alto Forward, and I am also the executive director of an allied organization called Peninsula for Everyone. We are a regional advocacy and political group that pushes for more equitable and sustainable housing and transportation policies, which is why we have a lot in common with Palo Alto Forward in terms of the types of policies that we're pushing to advance. And I will just briefly share my kind of personal housing story of how I first got involved with Palo Alto politics. I am one of the people who Elaine described. So when I first moved to Palo Alto, I was renting a tiny little cottage that was on a larger parcel that had 2 apartments in the back. So it was a small cottage, a 1-bedroom cottage, a studio apartment, and I think a 3-bedroom apartment on one parcel. And while I was renting there, this parcel was sold for $3.5 million. And very soon after it was sold, the redevelopment sign went up, and the plan for that parcel was to tear down all 3 units and build one giant single family home. So I called the city and I was like, this is crazy. We need more housing, not less. And the city told me there is nothing we can do to stop this development from happening. It's zone single family, it's ministerial review, it's gonna happen. And by the way, the 3rd unit was illegal to build in the first place, and it shouldn't have existed. So I started going to meetings and complaining about this situation, and was somewhat encouraged when, as Elaine mentioned, the city council moved towards looking at these missing middle housing types in the housing work plan. But in the 2 years that I've been following this very closely, the only progress that I have seen was my place where I used to live demolished, and the single family home is already almost finished. So that process goes very quickly, but I haven't seen any movement toward preserving missing middle housing types or getting more new ones. And what I would encourage audience members to think about is this is not a Palo Alto specific phenomenon. There are some cities that have better tenant protecting demolition controls, but the making housing or middle housing types illegal to build is very common throughout the entire peninsula. It's a regional problem. Maybe we can send in the follow-up email. There's an artist named Alfred Twu who went through the trouble of putting together all of our zoning maps on the peninsula. And you can see that almost all the land, developable land on the peninsula, is you can only build single family homes there. So this is a regional problem. We really need regional solutions. And what I have seen is the local solutions really haven't come to fruition fast enough to meet the demands of the crisis that we have had and will continue to have post-COVID. So one of the things that we will be sending in the follow-up will be a petition. This is a petition that is co-sponsored between Palo Alto Forward and Peninsula for Everyone, where we will be asking our state legislators to focus their legislative efforts on passing missing middle housing ordinances that would A, legalize missing middle housing, but B, also make it feasible. So how do we finance it? How do we make sure it's streamlined so that, as Elaine's example showed, where there were 15 different hearings to build 2 houses on one parcel, how do we make the process go faster? So check out your inboxes for that petition. I will just briefly mention a couple laws that are mentioned in the petition. One is SB 902, which in larger cities like Palo Alto would make up to 4 plexes by right. And then there is another bill that I would encourage you to take a look at that is called AB 3155, which would expedite the process of getting 4 plexes approved. So they would be approved by right, and they would be expedited if both of these laws were passed in the next legislative cycle. So yeah, that was all I wanted to say. Gail, did you want to add anything?
Yes, just a concluding statement. I want to thank all the panelists and all the attendees who joined us this evening. We encourage everyone to remain informed and engaged, and we sure hope that you join Palo Alto Forward. Our next event is on accessory dwelling units, and that will be on May 19th. And since you've learned so much today, we hope that you'll come to that panel online, of course. It will not be in person. Again, to remind you, our website is paloaltoforward.org. Thank you again, and we hope everyone stays safe and healthy. Thank you.
And Angie had the idea that if people just want to hang out, maybe we can stop live streaming it on Facebook. But if people want to stay on the chat and would like to talk, I don't know if panelists have to get off, but we're happy to just kind of chit chat as the numbers have kind of dwindled off. So maybe we'll give it a couple minutes. We'll stop live streaming on Facebook, and then we'll start unmuting people who would like to chit chat with us.
I'm going to stop
Yeah.
recording too.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've got a few minutes.
Okay, I probably